Hello everyone, thanks for tuning in to the Healthcare Podcast. We've got Dr. Vani and Dr. Kev here today to unpack some massive news coming out of Washington. The White House has announced a push to align the US Childhood Vaccine Schedule with countries like Germany and Japan. With the US currently recommending vaccines for 18 diseases versus Denmark's 10, this potential shift is shaking up the medical community. Let's get into what this means for the future of public health.
Welcome to the debate. Well, our focus today has it's shifted dramatically following the recent announcement on the United States core childhood vaccine schedule. This whole conversation it stems from that presidential memorandum from December 5, 2025, which, it mandated a review of our existing 18 disease schedule precisely because the U.S. was seen as a, quote, high outlier.
And now we have the outcome. Effective immediately, the schedule's been updated. It's been reduced from 18 recommended diseases down to 11. And the whole thing was framed as finally aligning the U.S. with global standards. It was even championed as a common sense reform.
That is the essential context. So we're debating not just the direction, but the justification for this massive overhaul. The central question for us is this. Does the new 11-disease schedule genuinely satisfy the presidential memorandum's core requirement? That any change has to be based on finding that foreign scientific evidence is definitively superior to our old domestic practices? Or was this reduction to 11 driven more by an administrative goal of just achieving numerical alignment? I'm going to argue that this bold move to 11 is a necessary and justified correction.
And I'm going to challenge that conclusion. I think that merely hitting a low number like 11 doesn't automatically validate the process, and it certainly doesn't prove that the foreign science behind it is in fact superior to the protective coverage we just decided to discard. My position is that the process, it prioritized the number over the science.
So my core position is really rooted in this necessity of correction. Before this announcement, the U.S. recommended vaccination for 18 diseases for all children. That put us so far outside the range set by our peers. You look at Denmark, it's at 10. Japan is at 14, Germany's at 15. The divergence was it was staggering. The U.S. schedule, standing alone at 18, was inherently suspicious because it departed so widely from what the rest of the developed world considered, best practices. The directive, therefore, correctly forced a reckoning. It prioritized a schedule focused only on diseases that present serious morbidity or mortality risks. By moving from 18 down to 11, the U.S. has signaled that it's adopting that more rigorous risk-focused standard you see in countries like Denmark. This 11-disease schedule finally ensures our core requirements are rooted in a globally accepted, higher standard of evidence.
I think we were over-vaccinating by global definitions, and 11 represents the consensus core.
I agree that the divergence warranted a review. Of course, the 18-disease schedule needed scrutiny, absolutely. However, numerical alignment is, to me, a symptom of a desired outcome, not the scientific basis for public health policy. The memorandum was explicit. It required HHS and the CDC to review the scientific evidence that informs those best practices and then determine if that evidence is superior to current domestic recommendations. We moved from 18 diseases to 11. That's a reduction of 7 protective measures that U.S. scientists just a short time ago deemed necessary. So we have to ask, did we genuinely prove the superiority of the science supporting this new schedule, or did we just slash the number to appease the mandate to align? The variance among our peers, 10, 14, 15, that already demonstrates there is no single international agreement on the exact number.
So reducing our list to 11, which is right at the very low end of that range, it suggests a focus on administrative reduction, not scientific synthesis.
I see why you're emphasizing the word superior, but let me offer a different perspective on that outlier status. The very fact that the U.S. recommended 3 to 8 more vaccines than other major developed nations was in itself prima facie evidence that our system needed a deep reevaluation. Why were we asking for so much more from American families? That divergence was the central problem the memorandum was trying to solve, and the solution is moving toward a globally recognized standard. The new schedule, at 11 diseases, it clearly falls within that international standard range.
This move implies an acceptance that the scientific threshold for requiring a vaccine in the core schedule has to be incredibly high-focused, only on the most severe public health threats. If Germany and Japan can manage their public health with schedules covering, 3 to 7 fewer diseases than our old one, the burden of proof rested squarely on our expansive U.S. schedule to justify its exceptionalism. The move to 11 is just a formal acceptance that the justification for those 7 extra diseases was frankly insufficient by global standards.
But outlier status only indicates difference, not inferiority. It might reflect unique domestic epidemiological factors. Maybe we have higher rates of certain diseases here, or a more conservative public health approach that prioritizes risk aversion. Crucially, the mandate wasn't a directive for numerical reduction. It was a demand for scientific proof of superiority. You can't just dismantle the 18-disease schedule because it was an outlier. We need transparency on the specific diseases that were cut and the data that explicitly demonstrated the foreign approach could handle those domestic risks better. And when we talk about superiority, we're not just talking about being different. Superiority in public health implies demonstrably better patient outcomes, or better cost effectiveness, or more rigorous scientific vetting. The quantity of diseases, 11 versus 18, that doesn't automatically equate to the quality or superiority of the science. And if the motivation was political, and some of the rhetoric around the announcement suggests it might have been, then the scientific integrity of the process and that superiority claim has to be very heavily questioned.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. The goal was to establish a schedule focused on diseases with serious morbidity or mortality risks. Let's just look at the philosophy of countries at the lower end, like Denmark, which clearly informed this new 11-disease target. Their system is streamlined, it's successful, and it focuses resources on diseases that represent truly critical threats. So, if the 7 diseases that were cut, and we can probably guess they include non-life-threatening illnesses or ones with very specific risk demographics, if they don't meet that globally accepted threshold of serious, then removing them from the required core is just intellectually sound. It raises the bar for inclusion, which is exactly what global alignment should do.
Okay, but let's ground this in the real-world implications. The 18-disease schedule, as of January 2025, explicitly included COVID-19. So we can logically infer that COVID-19 was one of the diseases potentially removed in this reduction to 11. That means taking that vaccine off the core requirement, despite, substantial domestic scientific evidence supporting its inclusion for public health, especially concerning things like long-term community transmission or MISC in children. The debate has to focus on the evidence for each of those 7 diseases that got cut. If foreign schedules exclude COVID-19 because maybe their population has higher background immunity or a different risk profile, that doesn't make their science superior for the U.S. context. It just means their context is different. Numerical reduction without a robust, published comparative analysis proving our domestic risk is now sufficiently low seems dangerous.
I'm not really sold on that line of reasoning, because the core mandate was to align with peer, developed countries to find the, quote, gold standard of science. If a disease, even one as politicized as COVID-19, is routinely excluded from the core schedules in Denmark, Japan, and Germany, it suggests that its inclusion in the U.S. core schedule as a required vaccine for all children, it may not meet that rigorous global standard of an essential public health intervention. The whole review process was designed to weigh the necessity of that domestic inclusion against established international standards. The goal wasn't to maintain every single domestic protection we had. The goal was to stress test every one of those 18 vaccines against the strongest global evidence. If 11 vaccines represent the globally accepted core, then the 7 that were cut were, by definition, the peripheral elements that just didn't stand up to that stress test.
That's a compelling argument in principle, I'll grant you. But have you considered that the U.S. schedule is often tailored to specific legal and logistic definitions of public health necessity here? If the U.S. had a specific, scientifically sound reason to require 18 diseases, maybe due to different definitions of childhood exposure or unique mobility risks in our population, the burden of proof is still on showing why the foreign evidence is superior at addressing those specific U.S. public health needs. Superiority requires a detailed comparative analysis of outcomes, not just input numbers. Where is the data demonstrating that the 11 disease schedule will result in statistically equivalent or better health outcomes for American children than the prior 18 disease schedule? Until that scientific paper is presented and peer-reviewed, the reduction to 11 looks like numerical parity achieved through an administrative decision, not proven scientific superiority.
All right, so let's pivot to the conceptual clarity of alignment then, especially now that we have the 11 disease schedule published. The U.S. goal was clearly defined: review and align with peer countries who are in that 10 to 15 range. The fact that the U.S. was outside that range was the empirical problem. Alignment means moving towards that standard, and 11 is a defensible choice. It sits very close to the lowest, most conservative end, which is Denmark's 10. By selecting 11, we are not just choosing a random number, we are fundamentally adopting the philosophical threshold of the most discerning peer nations. We're saying that only diseases that represent the most serious risks or those that require coordinated global eradication efforts merit inclusion in the core required list. This is standardization in action. It demonstrates that the new U.S. core schedule is rooted in a universally recognized global scientific consensus.
I come at it from a different way when we talk about alignment. If the only goal was numerical alignment, well, the memorandum was a success. But if we must align based on superior science, we have a problem. That international variation, 10, 14, 15, it shows there is no single scientific consensus number. There are, instead, different scientific priorities. Denmark's 10-disease philosophy is highly restrictive, focusing almost exclusively on individual severe morbidity. Germany's 15 might incorporate broader societal goals, like achieving higher herd immunity for a wider array of diseases. By choosing 11, the U.S. has simply cherry-picked a low target. We have to determine if the science supporting Denmark's restrictive schedule is inherently more rigorous or simply more restrictive, and those are vastly different scientific concepts. The directive required comparing frameworks, simply matching the number 11 without articulating which specific foreign framework was proven superior, suggests the process was more about achieving a political outcome than fulfilling the scientific mandate.
But that restrictive approach is what constitutes superiority in this context. If a schedule of 10 or 11 diseases provides robust public health protection while also reducing the burden of required interventions without a demonstrable loss of outcome, that is inherently a superior framework. It shows efficiency, prioritization, and a high confidence that some diseases we were maybe over-indexing on are less of a threat. The shift from 18 to 11 is proof that a rigorous review, as mandated, showed those extra 7 lacked the globally recognized justification for a required core vaccine.
The only way to prove superiority is to see the modeling that justifies removing 7 specific vaccines and shows that the projected domestic disease incidence remains acceptable or even decreases. The rhetoric of common sense and MAHA Moms used in the announcement, well, it risks undermining the very scientific rigor the memorandum demanded. If the reduction was just to achieve a feeling of simplification rather than a data-driven comparison of outcomes, then this new 11 disease schedule has failed the superior science test regardless of the number.
The memorandum initiated a vital process to make sure the U.S. core vaccine schedule is rooted in globally accepted, rigorous science, and to avoid what was perceived as unnecessary over-vaccination from its outlier status at 18 diseases. The alignment process, by demanding that comparison, has refined the schedule, elevated the standard of evidence, and resulted in a lean, globally acceptable 11-disease core.
And while the review process is always welcome, the danger lies in prioritizing that numerical target over the substantive comparative evidence. The key phrase is still that any update must be based on a determination that foreign best practices are superior. The choice of 11, the speed of this reduction, and the lack of immediate transparency on the justification for cutting specific diseases, it all suggests a process driven by an administrative desire for alignment, not a genuine demonstration of scientific superiority.
And so the decision to implement this 11-disease core schedule rests on whether we accept that the international consensus on vaccine necessity constitutes superior scientific evidence, or whether unique domestic needs demand continued protection that makes the U.S. a necessary outlier.
There is clearly much more to explore in the material regarding the operational definition of superior science in a public health context, especially when that definition requires reducing the protective coverage that's offered to our children.
Thank you for listening. The content provided in this episode is strictly the personal opinion of the speakers and is provided, as is. It does not constitute a doctor-patient relationship. The information shared should not be taken as professional medical advice or a recommendation for any specific course of treatment. Stay informed, but always talk to your own provider.